Copenhagen, Denmark. The Bioinnovation Institute is funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, and our mission is essentially to take all the great science that we see throughout the world, incubate at the BII to create companies that can go on, get financing, and become potentially these long-term sustainable companies that we want to talk about today. So with that in mind, essentially we're going to be talking about our ecosystem, how we can create companies that I believe stay and grow and help our region. And I think one of the most important things to achieve this is a well-functioning public market and a mindset to go into that market and succeed. And I'll ask you, Nikolai, as someone who's on the market at a commercial stage company, having worked at Pfizer, what are your thoughts here on a sustainable ecosystem and long-term ambition?
So one of my pet or mantras that I'm repeating over and over again is that when I'm looking at the stock market today, it's fantastic. For one of the things, particularly in Sweden, has been characterized from the last few years have been the inflow of life science companies who have been successful of raising money first at the IPO, but also issue new money to finance the development of the companies. I think that has been sparked a little by a very bullish stock market over the last nearly decade, since 2008, the dip in that year. But when you look at a more sustainable model, one of the things, and this is my mantra, is that we need more commercial stage companies, because the way that you're getting long-term sustainability is your own ability to self-fund your next stage and invest into the next new products and portfolio. And to get that bridge between R&D focused companies into commercial stage, I think is really the critical part for in particular Sweden right now, where we have so many very innovative early stage companies, but we have very, very few companies, and most of the companies that are in the commercial stage are very small. So this is really, how do we get that bridge built between R&D and into commercial stage, and do we have a stock market that actually are capable of financing also these commercial investments that you need when you start launching in the US. And as I've done it once, and I'm about to do that once, I think it's easily a 200 to 300 million SEK investment if you're just going to start up as a smaller specialty pharma company from a commercial stage. So this is where I think we're at a critical stage, and if Sweden could bridge that, I think we can get a sustainable ecosystem. I think in Denmark, it's a completely different situation, as Denmark has some extremely large companies, some of the world-leading companies, like the one that you indirectly have financed from Novo Nordic. We also have Lundbeck, which are based on their ownership model as basically, by definition, sustainable in Denmark, as they can never be sold to any other country. So I think this is a very critical time in Sweden, and I know one of the other panelists is just about to go into the commercial stage, and I think it's interesting to get that perspective of where are we in the bridge, and what can we do to strengthen that bridge, and particularly in Sweden, I think, where we lack these strong commercial players.
Very good. And I think you mentioned Magnus here. So Magnus, you're a CEO on the Swedish stock market. Yep. Is it serving you well? I mean, are you happy? Yes. Or would you rather have sold the company early and made a lot of money?
No, definitely. No, and I think I agree with Nikolai's comments here. I think what we need to do is to build, you would say, a sustainable cluster. I think we have a lot of world-class life science competences, but there are also some that we don't have in the region yet. And before going into Celia 6 years ago, I've been investing in both in the venture space, but also in the public equity markets. So I've seen it from different angles. And to me, this is really, if we make a comparison that, if we look at emerging economies, African economies, for instance, they may have a lot of raw material. They may have mining, they may have, a lot of agriculture, and they sell it early. And then somebody else will acquire that and process it and create the value. What we are really good at, I think, in the Nordic is that we have a lot of very good science. We can also translate it a little bit into, and increasingly into new products in pharmaceuticals. But we don't have the last and most value-creating step, which is the commercialization. If you look at the US stock market, you look at the explosion in share prices, very often it's when they go from development stage to successful commercial stage. That's where you have basically a vertical curve on the market value. And I think that's what we need to create here, and we need to create it again and again. So we have a group of people with a skill set that can do a US launch or a global launch of products, and that will create a lot more value than what we're doing today. And I think that's super important. So we are in Ascelia Pharma, we are in orphan oncology, so rare cancer indications. We have an ongoing phase 3 program for our lead program, get results second half of next year, and you know, we are building up the commercial team. We have a you know, very experienced chief commercial officer, but we will need to make a lot of recruitments, and we are you know, that's a super exciting phase to be in.
Very good, thank you, Magnus. And so Adam, this must be interesting for you in that you have at least two, I wouldn't call customers, clients, two people on your exchange talking about building a public market. What's your view on the status of the markets that we have here and their ability to finance companies to commercial development?
Well, I'm not by any means the expert in terms of sector specific overall, but I do work with many sectors, and I think what is fascinating is with this particular sector is how dynamic it is in leveraging the exchange, not only on a one-off basis, but on a reoccurring basis. So I think from our perspective, what makes the Nordic market, and I think Nikolai was onto it as well as Magnus, is that the Swedish market really stands out on so many levels, even on a European level. If you look at the number of companies that we are supporting in accessing the public markets, it's astounding to see how we're supporting not only larger companies, but in particular smaller, medium-sized companies accessing the public markets, because ultimately what they're looking for is the ability to recruit, to reward, and to finance growth over time. And these are all assets that they can leverage the public markets for. So when we look at the public markets here, especially for the Nasdaq First North, which is our growth market, it's astounding to see how we're able to support small and medium-sized companies, not only raise capital as a part of the IPO, but on a recurring basis. So the secondary capital that these companies are able to raise is really quite significant. Is that enough? Well, that's a debatable question. I think Europe is still, of course, catching up vis-a-vis the US. But having said that, I think what is unique, and that's something we also discuss on a US level, is that our ability here in Sweden in particular to support these smaller companies to leverage the public markets earlier is partially driven by the fact that there's a lack of VC, but there's also a very active, dynamic public market that is actually quite well functioning, both in terms of being able to raise capital, but also to create liquidity. So we are getting more and more interest, not only from Nordic companies, but also international companies to access the Swedish market in particular. And we're starting to see a spillover effect into Denmark in Nasdaq First North, and we're also seeing a good dynamic in Finland. So is this enough? Good question, but I think it's great that we have this as a complementary platform in the ecosystem to support this sector in its further growth. And at the end of the day, it's really getting these companies to commercialization, which is key. And I think the transparency and the credibility that comes along with the listing can potentially help these companies in that process. But ultimately, it's being able to access financing and accessing the right people is key for them.
Very good, thank you. And so I think that what's important here is also that the Swedish government has actually taken active measures to promote a stock ownership culture, and maybe which is some of the investors that are on your First North. So I think this is an opportunity to introduce Jenny and ask you a question. So Jenny, if you could briefly introduce yourself, and then I'll ask a follow-up question regarding the government incentives for retail investing in life sciences.
Jenny, you're on mute.
No one has ever done that, right? So my name is Jenny Nordborg, and I'm the National Life Science Coordinator, and I'm heading the offices for life sciences within the Swedish government. So therefore, I report to 3 ministers. I work with sort of a cross-border within government organization. It's extremely important and really tricky.
Understood. So I think what's interesting here is that Sweden has this tax incentive, or this account that incentivizes investors to actually invest in shares. Can you talk about what role this plays in actually promoting retail investing in the life sciences?
Well, so from the Swedish government's perspective, when it comes to life sciences, there is a very holistic and long-term perspective. Now we all, it's really in our culture to be, as you say, it's really public promotion to have shareholders, but what we have struggled with, that you've already been discussing, and that has been the struggle for Sweden for the past 20, 30 years, is really the ability to grow mid-sized companies. We are a superpower as a startup nation, also in life sciences, especially in health tech now. I mean, that's booming, but really to be able to grow the mid-sized companies. And I have been heading the Health and Life Sciences division at the Innovation Agency for many years. And I've been through all these challenges, and still the palette of different initiatives that we have are still not really fruitful in growing mid-sized companies. And I think that's a challenge that we will live with for a long time, but that doesn't mean that is not a focus for the government. Sorry, Bobby, I think that I really took a U-turn on your question here. You have to repeat that again.
No, those are excellent. So you're identifying a challenge here is the presence of investors interested in commercialization stage, in growing early stage companies. And I'll ask you, Adam, does that reflect a lack of institutional investors? So now we're talking about retail investors, and they're incentivized, but are institutional investors interested in companies in this market? And does that reflect a lack of quality, or does that reflect a lack of awareness? Adam?
And again, I'm going to be the optimist here. So from my perspective, I think what makes the Swedish market, which you were alluding to, and Jenny also touched upon, is that at the end of the day, 80% of the households here in Sweden own shares. So the government has taken a long-term positioning that the public markets should be accessible for the retail. Around that, we have then created a structure which makes it easier for companies, for investors to access the markets through investor savings accounts, which has become now a spread phenomenon across Denmark and Finland as well, based on the Swedish success. What is interesting is that we see, if you take Nasdaq First North, on a yearly basis, we have 10 companies on an average that move and transition into the main market. We see capital raises increasing in terms of size. We just, there was recently a company called Nanopharm that raised 90 million euros on Nasdaq First North. The secondary capital raises are increasing. We see more and more institutional money moving into Nasdaq First North, which is the home for these smaller growth companies. I think that is symbolical for the fact that these institutional money is reaching into these companies to be a part earlier and to be able to support these companies into the next phase. So from that perspective, I think the trend is positive. Is it enough? No, I think it can definitely improve. And the fact that we have so many success stories coming out of these markets is also attracting more and more institutional money to these markets, which traditionally have been seen more as a backyard rather than the growth hub that we would like it to be. And additionally, we're also seeing companies that have taken the journey on the Nordic markets now potentially then do a listing in the US. Calliditas is a great example recently, which ultimately then taps into another investor base, building another commercial story. Is this enough? Questionable, but we have something that is unique vis-a-vis the other European markets, and I think that's something that we should continue investing in and making sure that everybody understands the value that is being created there.
Very good, thank you, Adam. And I think this is a nice transition. You talked about First North and retail investors. I think maybe this is a nice transition to talk about early stage financing and its role. Magnus, you have a question?
Yeah, no, just one before we transition, because I think we have a lot of things going in our region in terms of creating this. but I think we have so much more potential. In that regard, I'm super optimistic that if we do the right things, it can be, you know, an amazing journey. And one of my other, Nikolai mentioned earlier, he has this pet a mantra thing that he likes to bring up, and one of mine is really we should have one market, healthcare market on NASDAQ in the Nordics, right? We should have one healthcare index. You could set up mutual funds. You can have a lot of focus that would be cross-border, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. And I think that would be important. We should also, you know, the government should talk together and find to secure that if you are a Swedish investor, you pay the same cost for holding a Danish share or Swedish share or Finnish share. It should be the same. So you should really try and align that and get that as one platform. I think that will have tremendous attractiveness, and it would make the market also much more interesting to international investors.
I couldn't agree more. And sorry, Bobby, I'm jumping in right into this because I think it's a very interesting topic. I think the big issue that Europe has is that it's a fragmented market, and every market is trying to build up its own liquidity pool, its own dynamic. When in reality, I think that's where the US stands out, is that it's one market. US has another challenge, other challenges in terms of the cost of capital to be a listed company. I think that's what we have achieved here in the Nordics, that it's accessible to be a listed company. And there's more and more money off the markets in the private environment. But creating a Nordic market would be very interesting. There are so many regulatory dynamics there that need to be aligned on a Nordic level. And I think if we in the Nordics were able to, through the governments and through the regulators, able to sit down around the table and create something like that, that would be fantastic, because I think everyone would benefit of that. Ultimately, as a NASDAQ provider or as a provider of the public markets, we're trying to pool more and more of our resources to make sure that our Nordic markets are more accessible. But there's a lot more that can be done, because ultimately one pool of capital would be much more beneficial than different fragmented pools, because that makes it inefficient.
Yeah, understood. So Jenny, we're making policy for you.
Yes, and that's great. And I think that maybe this is an area where life sciences could be a forerunner. Life sciences is always looking at the at the finance business and the ability to use data-driven innovation and new ways of tools. But if it's something that life sciences is good at, it's the joint policy for regulation. So we used to have national regulations for medical directives. Now we have a European regulation. So maybe there could be a forerunner, but I do see one of few obstacles in getting there. Doesn't mean that we won't get there, but I think it's interesting, and it all maybe boils down to the whole tax reform debate that is long ongoing.
Yeah, very good.
And just to add on that, and I think going with that, because I think different countries are doing some great things that other Nordic countries could be inspired of. But for instance, also as a small biotech company, we are in Malmö, so in Sweden, but we also have Danish employees, including myself, and we have you know, a lot of companies in our region, southern Sweden, Copenhagen, have employees from the other side of the border, and all the, you could say, the tax things now. COVID-19 makes it more difficult to work from home, and also the border control. So this morning on the radio, it was a 50-minute queue to go from Sweden to Denmark, right? So all of these barriers needs to be managed in a better way than we have today. And it's not, you know, it's something where you could say the governments of the different countries must come together and say, we want, I mean, life science is so important for the Nordics, for our future growth and welfare. We should really invest and make that easier to be successful rather than more difficult.
Very good.
Well, I agree. I think one of the challenges is also that this sector does not create so many jobs. And that per se creates a sort of the wrong dynamic, because the IP that we have here in the Nordic with these growth companies is key for further in creating so much more value than just only jobs. And so from that perspective, I think, you know, the governments should really look at this sector as a key sector to be supporting. but I think overall, we spend a lot of time in the EU, in Brussels, and we talk a lot about the SME factor. And constantly, the Nordic markets, and particularly the Swedish market, is a prime example of what they would like to replicate in other in other European markets. And we are still looking at seeing how we can further improve what we have, not looking at it from a success perspective. So I think putting all these thoughts together and really driving that on a Nordic level would be very beneficial for many.
Very good. So I'd like to talk about early stage financing, and I think this is typically the type of panel discussion where we then start asking the government for money to help bring out science out of university and make companies. I think I'll relate it to the First North because we've talked about this. So one of my experiences here is BII companies typically look for venture financing and not to do a public listing. It isn't that popular. It wasn't made more popular, but we had a visit from an investment banker that told us that you can come on the First North market, but you can't raise a lot of money. On the other hand, your valuation is going to be very low. So how is that a typical example of what's on offer for maybe a cross-border listing here for a Danish company on the First North? I'll talk to you. We'll ask Adam, and then Magnus will ask about your experience when you listed.
Well, listen, I think from our perspective, there's a whole range of listings taking place on Nasdaq First North. So I think, if you look back at 2009, we had 120 companies listed on Nasdaq First North on a Nordic level. Now that is close to 400. So you have the whole range of companies that are coming from the smallest of listing, where they actually don't raise any money, they just access the capital market to create liquidity. But then you have on the other end, you have a company raising 100 million euros. So it's a full range. So it's very difficult to mix everything. At the end of the day, I think what is key for companies is that they have the option.
Yeah.
Because if they don't have the option, then basically they're stuck with one alternative. And I think at the end of the day, the company has to make the decision, what is the pros and cons with the various alternatives? I'm not saying that a listing at an early stage is all pros. It comes with its challenges because you have to create predictability, you have to create a dialogue with the markets. But at the end of the day, it also gives you other additional advantages like visibility, credibility, liquidity, not only to attract talent, but it also creates the possibility to raise more money on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis, which I think is key for this sector. Very
good. Actually, I'll ask Nikolai. So does that reflect your experience when you were maybe an early stage company moving into a larger company in your listing experience?
So Orexo was listed when I joined Orexo, but I'm also on the board of a smaller life science company. So I'm which just raised a second round of money last year. So I'm pretty familiar with this. I think one of the issues, or you can say the advantage of the market right now for a lot of new startup or small companies has been that it has been very, very strong development, and there's been a lot of money inflow, which made it easy. And I think I must admit, looking at some of the companies, I wonder if the First North strategy was the plan A, or it's actually a plan B because they couldn't raise sufficient venture capital fund. Mm-hmm. The issue I have when I look at a lot of these companies is that they actually lack institutional ownership. So you have this. Where do we get the money when the market turned bearish? Because sooner or later we will have a market that goes down. I think it would be naive to think that we won't have a dip on the stock market again. And what do you do if that's just when you're about to raise a lot of money for the next stage? That's the advantage of having strong institutional owners, that a lot of them take that responsibility and actually support the company in that situation. But if you have a company where the largest owner is the founder, who's probably, even though you on paper have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of liquidity, and then most of the rest of the owners are small retail owners, I think that can create a very difficult situation. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the concerns I have, is also for sustainability of the ecosystem, because in an ecosystem you always have someone who is a taker of these companies. And with the lack of Swedish companies who have the ability and strength to actually acquire some of the younger, or some of the smaller companies, these companies, if they have a strong innovation or pipeline, they would be acquired by someone outside Sweden. Maybe Denmark, even though there haven't been that many acquisitions, I think, by the large Danish companies in Sweden. So often it would be a US company or someone who would buy the rights, and then all of the workplaces will leave. And I noticed that Adam said that that we don't have that many workplaces. I think that is definitely because that when you're in an R&D stage, you don't need that many people. But if you get into the commercial stage, that's actually a different story. And I just heard that pharmaceuticals in Sweden have now surpassed trucks and was during the summer, I think, the largest export to goods out of Sweden. So there's definitely a route for more employment. And I just look at Orexo, we are 150 people right now, and out of those 150, 120 works with something related to commercialization. So when you get into that stage, there will be more employment, but in early stages you won't. So again, I'm coming back for a sustainable ecosystem. You need to have companies who generate their own cash flow, and that way create a sustainability in the company. Because what you can also do always, even look at an Orexo, right now have turned into a negative cash flow because we're doing some investments into launches in the US. But if we want, we could just stop that and we would turn back to be a positive cash flow company. So that is a sustainable business model, not being forced to raise money when you get to the next stage. And that is actually what I'm a little nervous about in the market right now, is that massive inflow of life science companies. And if we get into a situation where the market turns down, where are they going to go to get those money?
Yeah. And so, Nicola, I would echo your concern about the founder majority shareholder company with minority shareholders who are retail investors. That is the dynamic that we at BII at least are trying to avoid creating in any listings that we do. And it raises the question about institutional investors, early stage. When I was in the UK, there is a system in the UK called the Entrepreneur Investment Scheme, where fund managers can collect funds to invest early stage companies, R&D heavy, and then they get a 30%, they're certified EIS compliant, and then the investor gets 30% of their money back from the UK government, and then it's capital gains tax free. Jenny, as a government representative here, has the Swedish government at least considered any tax schemes to try and incentivize the formation of such funds, of institutional funds with private capital?
Of course, this has been a long-term discussion also, and I do think that the UK scheme has been really beneficial, right? Mm-hmm. in the UK. And so actually I think that for the dialogue, I would like to hear more from Nicola and Magnus. Would you think if that would really be one of the key success factors for Sweden? I think that needs to become much more present. We have had such a long discussion on, we now have a much larger R&D tax refund for companies. We do have some investment tax rebate, but on a very small level, and I think also very short term for younger companies. But again, then Nicola and Magnus, you know this much better. And of course, we have the expert tax schemes. So there are many things that come into play, but I think that this is one of the important factors. And if you're asking, is the government looking at this? Yes, the government is always looking at these type of measures. But then again, what could the calculated outcome of that really be? I'd like to comment on some of the points raised earlier also.
Yeah, please.
How important this sector is for Sweden. The 40,000 jobs, people that work in pharma and medtech in Sweden, that's not neglectable. So that's very, very strong. And even though it's 20% of the exports in Denmark, it's still 7-8% of the exports in Sweden. The Cytiva site stands for 1% of Swedish export alone, AstraZeneca for 3-4, something like that. I mean, those are only examples that this is an extremely important sector economy-wise when it comes to that. And I also wanted to ask you then, when it comes to the pipeline, because we were talking about that there will be a downturn in the public markets. We did see that some months ago, a 30% fall on the stock market, and immediately that raised tremendous concern on how of the sustainability of all those projects in pipeline. Were they able to survive only the few coming months? And in my ways that we are living through this pandemic for a long time now, we will see a lot of different developments up and down. So what we're talking about this here will be long-term changes. I'm very concerned in what the sustainability is right now for the coming 2 or 3 years. Even within the system, what the measures are also, if there's a need also for acute measures.
Can I start commenting here? Just you asked the question. So I think these government funds for R&D projects and others, I know several small companies. That's a very good start. But when you get a little larger, the money is far from enough for supporting a project going into larger clinical trials, and you need a different financing. What I think is more critical is your access to talent, and I think in particular in Sweden we have a lack of commercial talents in the way that we have a lot of people who work commercializing in Sweden, but we don't have a lot of people who have any experience of commercializing outside Sweden. So you need to attract people from Switzerland, from England, from the US, Denmark to go cross border, and I'm pretty sure Magnus will soon talk about some of the issues. But even I have that situation. So when the way that you work in life science is that it's a very long development stage, and you have to find these talents, and you often have to be very creative to get them to work in Sweden, allowing them maybe to stay where they are, and that's exactly what I have done. Actually, I found a fantastic person who worked a lot with life science companies in Switzerland who lived in Munich, and for a while he was then commuting to Sweden for 1 day a week. And there we have a favorable system called the sink tax. So you have but now comes the small issue that of course when you get into the stage where the job becomes so big that it's getting difficult to commute, you want that person to move to Sweden, because then we're creating a department around the person from being a specialist. You actually suddenly create a department, but surprise, then you're not eligible for the expert tax. So when you're being sink taxed, then you can't apply for the expert tax. And just knowing how you work in the life science industry, having long projects where it can be someone who is a scientist to sit on specialist competence, and if you're successful and you're gearing up, you want to build a department around those people. But then at least my experience that the expert tax is not working because you can't apply for that, and you can't apply for it when you're on sink tax, and if you move to Sweden you can't apply anyway because you've been taxed in Sweden before, and I think it's one of those where life science industry is different from other, and I know maybe the even more concrete examples is some of the issues that Magnus have with Danish people coming to Sweden, and I have had exactly the same. It's not easy to have a person living in Denmark commuting to Sweden and finding out the tax system, which is unfortunate, because I think this is for Sweden the closest pool of talents where you have people who have worked commercial globally is actually in Denmark, and when we're making it difficult for people to commute, it becomes a problem. But Magnus is much more experienced and much shorter, much more concrete than I have, so I will leave the word to him.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot. No, I agree with that.
Magnus, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off just because we have 5 minutes left and we do have questions.
Yeah, great.
And so, and one of the questions here, and because I think we only have time for one question, is a question regarding key strategies for greater collaboration, which is related to what you just said, Nikolai, about commuting and tax. Key strategies for greater collaboration across the Nordic life science industry that would be beneficial for the ecosystem's growth. And rather than asking one person here, what I think we should do is maybe also try and wrap up. If each of us could try and think of 3 things they would, if they were the czar of life sciences for this region, 3 things they would focus on to try and make this work with regards to creating a Nordic market and sustainability. And with that in mind, why don't we ask Adam first? So your top 3 things that we need to work on for greater sustainability in our market.
Why don't I just start with one, maybe?
One
but
thing.
I think, or 2. I think Magnus' concept of creating a stronger Nordic region, I think would be very beneficial for many parties involved, or for the whole ecosystem. I think secondly, I think the topic of the value that this sector is creating for the economy, for the overall development of society, I think it's key to be able to support the sector. So I think, the initiatives that are coming from the EU in terms of IPO funds, secondary funds, government supported, where they can actually support these companies in the later stages, are key initiatives, which I think we should adopt here in the Nordics. And then to Nikolai's and Magnus' points is, let's tear down the barriers in terms of the Nordic, at least our Nordic region should be much more free-flowing in terms of being able to attract talent and to cross-leverage, cross-fertilize more. And we certainly are trying to do our share, but we can do more. And I think having this dialogue, not on a panel basis, but on a regular basis, I think would be very beneficial to identify key changes.
Very good. So you're offering your services as a committee to the local government,
Absolutely.
a think
Absolutely.
tank to them.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. I feel volunteered. Magnus.
Yeah, no, and just to jump back to the previous discussion, I think one of the things is having the easier cross-border or relocation of international experts. I think short-term, long-term, it's going to be a major value creating and job creating boom, right? So Nikolai mentioned 80% of his staff is related to commercial. We need more companies, and right now in Sweden we don't have enough commercial stage people who can commercialize around the world. Even in Denmark it's a similar problem, right? So I think that having that to be easy from a tax administrative perspective is really important. And as a small company, all the different schemes and all the different forms and all the different rules, it's super complicated. And then I think the third one is, for some of the other countries in the Nordics to be inspired of the more flexible labor market regulation where you can, that we have in Denmark. For instance, when we grow and we are basically doubling the size of the company every year, when we recruit a new person, they have 3-month notice, even, all kinds of job positions. That's a standard in Sweden. So even though we're growing, it goes much slower than I would like. And that is a challenge. It's also what happens in our industry, and so far, knock on wood, we've not had any major issues. But if a company in life science, if there is a negative result from development on the lead program or something where you need to downsize, it's very expensive in Sweden to let go of employees, something that everybody hates to do, but sometimes that is necessary to make the company survive. That's very expensive in Sweden, which I think is a big barrier for actually creating regular jobs. I think there's a reason why in Sweden you have so many self-employed people who do consulting work to various companies. That's because the companies do not dare to take on that financial burden potentially. I think that would be a good place to improve as well.
Very good, thank you. So running short on time, so Nikolai, I'll ask you for your most important thing, and we'll ask the same of Jenny. Oh, you're muted, Nikolai.
Nikolai, you're muted.
I will try to keep it as a one-liner. So, and I will steal one of them from the panel. I wouldn't have said that before the panel, but I actually think the idea of a Nordic financial market for health life sciences is a great thing. Then talent. I already mentioned that. I think that we need to ensure that we have flexibility in these systems to attract talents. Is incredibly important. And then as a final part, I actually think, and this is more to Jenny, who probably have the last comment, is I think there should be more focus on this commercialization and talk to smaller stage companies. What do you need for support for commercialization? And I can give a concrete example. I actually think that you can work more actively with the MPA, or Medical Product Agency in Sweden, that they can support small companies to understand what it takes to get the products approved and become a little more advisory than they are. And I think we need to be very careful of raising fees for small companies, which are making them move, for example, clinical trials out of Sweden. But so that would be a concrete example that we can give to Jenny, who have the last point.
Very good. And Jenny, do you feel like we've given you a very long laundry list? I almost apologize on behalf of the panel here.
No, you haven't. I think that you have sort of clarified positions, and I must say that I always welcome the input and dialogue from all companies, and I've been working in this job for the last 2 years and basically doing that, and that is important. It's important that we're still having that dialogue, because the sector really needs to push the government. Otherwise, if we don't hear you, it won't happen. So just keep on pushing. And but my intake is something completely different, actually. What I would like to see, if we have a common financial market, we should also have a common market for implementing precision medicine. I really do think that we need a better uptake of innovative methods, innovative treatments in our healthcare and welfare system. I think that will both attract talents, and that will also attract investments long term.
Very good. So thank you very much to this panel. Let that be the final inspirational words from Jenny. And with those words, I'll say thank you for participation, and look forward to speaking to you next time. And maybe we'll take up the topic of precision medicine at that time. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone.